In July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began on the Western Front. 20,000 men died on the first day. In 5 months, over 500,000 Allied troops were wounded or killed.
For miles, in every direction, it was just desolation. When you first see it, you think, my God, what's this? Everything's swept to the ground, just piles of bricks, tree stumps sticking up for miles and miles. The whole of the Somme area, to me, was like that.
Death? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It's the first time I'd ever seen death. It was so shocking on the first time that one, and then after that I'm not going to be this. I'll run away from it sort of business because you never ever did, of course. And you see, in my case, I was in charge of a large number of men.
Now officers, who had not been affected in large numbers, were beginning to break down when confronted by the loss of so many of their men. Guy Botwright was a platoon commander in the Labour Corps, in charge of 36 men. He was 17 years old.
I was probably censoring letters, and an explosion might have taken place. Something. I had a pencil, you see, and it would have been, I would have dropped everything, and the mind would have gone blank. And I think that's what must have happened, because I can't tell you, waiting in the trench for something to come along to take me away. I had no pain, so there was no feeling of pain, because I hadn't been wounded or in any shape or form. But I couldn't concentrate. I've no idea what the doctors gave me for it. I couldn't tell you. Because the world had ceased to exist, I think.
Guy Botwright was diagnosed with shell shock. He was evacuated to a specialist officers' hospital in Brighton. Officers' shell shock often differed from the other ranks. Stammering, loss of memory and irritability were all common symptoms. Captain Leland wrote to his wife,
I feel I'm an awful wreck these days. The weather does not suit me. I'm sorry to say that my temper is such that few come near me, just as well. I should love to get some leave, but I don't like to ask. It was suggested to me the other day, but in such a way that if I had risen to it, I should have felt that I was shirking.
You could see from his letters he was crying out to be given a rest, given a break. Had he been given a break, he probably would have been able to continue indefinitely. But without that break, you see it getting worse, getting through to him.
Shell shock was creating a loss of manpower. And this slowly but surely became more and more obvious, but it became blindingly obvious at the Battle of the Somme, when 35,000 men broke down. And the army authorities could not ignore this anymore. They had actually been working towards this. the work of Myers and others, had been treating and were treating people successfully up until this time. But this was the real major loss. It had been learned from previous wars that disease, injuries, they could certainly cut your manpower down, but now they had to accept that the psychological response to warfare could do the same.
In response to the crisis, the War Office took action. More specialist hospitals were opened throughout the country. Moss Side Military Hospital at Maghull in Liverpool had room for 500 patients, all from the ranks. Under Dr. Richard Rouse, a Freudian psychologist, a team of doctors were recruited to treat the shell-shocked men. The army, usually conservative in such matters, was so desperate for a solution to the problem that they were happy to place their faith in the new treatment. The Maghull doctors believed that the cause of the men's condition was a traumatic event, which had been repressed and now lurked in their unconscious. The trauma might be revealed through the analysis of their dreams.
The theory suggested that if you recounted your tale, if you recounted your nightmares, if you talked about it, felt the emotion with the story, you could let it go. It would somehow lose its power of control over you.
Dream analysis seemed to work. In 1916, Richard Rouse, the medical superintendent at Maghull, wrote about his methods in The Lancet. He described one man who was tormented by a fearful nightmare. In his sleep, he was heard to shout, "It was an accidental shot. Yes, Major, it was not my fault." Exploring the man's unconscious mind revealed his terrible secret. It emerged that the man had mistakenly shot a wounded comrade crawling back to the lines through no man's land. After unburdening himself of this memory, the patient was healed. It was the birth of the talking cure.
The psychoanalysts had to probe deeper and deeper, which made it very terrible for those looking on, which was a sister or staff nurse.
Mary Jolly worked alongside the psychoanalysts at another military hospital, the Radcliffe in Nottingham. She helped nurse the most traumatized.
Many of them were being asked questions that were distressing them very much. But the psychoanalysts had to get to know what was causing the trouble. There was one instance where the psychoanalyst was trying to get out of the man's mind, and he was having great difficulty in probing. And in the end he got it out that he had seen tanks go into battle, and lying in the path of the tanks was wounded men. They just mowed over them. They had to go on. Your emotions were disturbed too, you know, because they disturbed you. You know, it was a painful thing to see a man quite out of control. Not good to see a man in tears. And you had to be there. That was distressing for those looking on.
Many of the Maghull doctors, like psychologist Tom Peer, developed a genuine sympathy for their patients. Working-class men who, in peacetime, they would never have had the opportunity to treat.
My father felt very deeply for them, there's no doubt about that. And he would tell you of a particular case and this man's background and the sort of family that he came from, and that the families would not understand. This was the sad thing, that even when the chap was so-called cured, and some of them went back to the front and some of them didn't, but he was afraid that their families would never be able to understand what had happened.
The revolutionary methods pioneered at Magal were a success. 2/3 of those discharged were declared fit, only to be sent back to the slaughter. The Magal doctors never forgot that curing a patient might send him back to the very cause of his breakdown, the fighting in France. It was an ethical dilemma at the heart of their work.
I think my father would have been extremely unhappy at the idea that this medical treatment that he was helping to give would be used in order to sign them off as fit and send them back to the trenches. I'm quite sure it would be a very sad thing, but he didn't talk about that. And in a way, of course, that hospital was run as a military hospital. He was under military discipline.
The army was always concerned, with some justice, that men might be faking shell shock in order to escape military service.
This man pretended that he couldn't keep food down. He vomited back any meal that he was given. And he didn't lose weight. And he was seen to get a parcel of food over the fence. His wife had come on one side of the fence, so that he was not undernourished. And that was why he wasn't losing weight. That was malingering.
The problem was that without an obvious physical wound, it was very difficult to tell the difference between a man who was shirking and one who had genuine symptoms of mental distress.
Of course, the real debate is whether this is unconscious or consciously created. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulties came along. Were these people malingering? This is a great theme throughout military psychiatry. And all of the psychiatrists I've read say that malingering was rare.
In June 1916, the War Office formally recognized that shell shock was a genuine war wound and had ordered that the condition should be treated as such. But unofficially, many continued to regard it as no more than cowardice. A case of shell shock could devastate the morale of a unit. Senior officers feared it was contagious, and harsh measures were often taken to prevent it from spreading.
The officer, perhaps in charge of a group, and one fella cracks up, he's got to, the officer has got to be careful or to watch that the rest of his men don't crack up with him. There have been cases, I believe, even of men being shot by their officer for absolute cowardice, which the poor fella can't help it, but he's just broken down.
Although shell shock was now recognized by the War Office as a medical illness, it could not be used as a form of defense at a court-martial. A soldier charged with cowardice or desertion was either insane or responsible for his actions and should be shot. Private Harry Farr was a 26-year-old Londoner serving with the 1st West Yorkshire Regiment. He had been in France since the outbreak of war and had spent months in the trenches.
In May 1915, Father was put into hospital at Le Havre, and he was suffering from shell shock. Well, he'd always written to Mother and kept her posted of how things were going, but the letters that came from him in the hospital, he had to dictate to the nurse because he was so traumatized, his hands were shaking so much, he just couldn't write the letter. And that was the last letter that Mother ever got from my father.